Conscious leaders put people first, but so do conscious companies. I spent 7 years of my life working at Skyrun Aspen, always joking that it was my public service subsidy. And they walk this. During COVID, Skyrun helped short-term rentals transition to long-term housing so locals had a place to stay and owners could keep their homes. And when the time was right, they helped us shift right back as a community. If you're looking for a vacation rental company that leads with care, then Skyrun is it. To experience their commitment to community and care in Colorado, use code HOP15, that's Healing Our Politics 15, for 15% off a stay. Whether for yourself or someone in your community, check the link in the show notes for more.
Hello, my name is Skippy Mesereau, coach, former elected official, and lifetime public servant. Welcome to Healing Our Politics, the show that shows you, the heart-centered public servant and political leader, how to heal our politics by starting with the human in the mirror. It is my job to sit down or stand up with the best experts in all areas of human development, thought leaders, coaches, therapists, authors, scientists, and more, to take the best of what they have learned and translate it specifically for the public service experience, providing you actionable, practical, tactical tools that you can test out today in your life and with your teams. I will also talk to leaders across the globe with a self-care practice, getting to know them at a deeply human and personal level so that you can learn from their challenges and journey. Warning, this is a post-partisan space. Yes, I have a bias. You have a bias. We all have a bias. Everybody gets a bias. And I will be stripping out all of the unconscious cues of bias from this space. No politics, partisanship, or policy here. Because well-being belongs to all of us. And we will all be better served if every human in leadership, regardless of party, ideology, race, or geography, are happier, healthier, and more connected. This show is about resourcing you, the human doing leadership, and trusting you to make up your own damn mind about what to do with it and what's best for your community. So, as always, with love, here we go. Welcome to the Healing Our Politics podcast, the show that shows you, the heart-centered leader, how to heal our politics by starting with the human in the mirror. In today's episode, I sit down with expert in moral psychology and the science of political polarization, Dr. Kurt Gray. Kurt is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, for now, where he directs the Deepest Beliefs Lab and the Center for Moral Understanding, two groundbreaking institutions using behavioral science to explore how our most deeply held beliefs shape society and how we can leverage this knowledge to bridge divides across difference. Sounds important. He also serves as an adjunct professor of organizational behavior at the Kenan-Flagler Business School. Kurt is an award-winning and Harvard-trained researcher and teacher, recipient of the Janet Spence Award for Transformative Early Career Contributions, the Sage Youth Scholar Award, and the Theoretical Innovation Prize, and the Psy-Chi Award for undergraduate teaching excellence. His work has been featured in the New York Times, The Economist, Scientific American, Wired, and NPR's Hidden Brain, as well as TED Stage Is, plural. His new book, Outraged, ! Why We Fight About Morality and Politics and How to Find Common Ground, has achieved #1 status, ding, 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 on Amazon in his category. And I just am finishing reading it. You should too. His work on how people understand harm, agency, and morality has been published in top scientific journals, and his paper on bridging divides won Best Paper at the Frank Public Interest and Communications Conference. Kurt is doing what few dare, bringing together neuroscience, political science, psychology, and communication to explore the root causes of polarization and uncover practical tools to reduce it. In a time where dehumanization is the norm, Kurt is showing what becomes possible when we bring curiosity, evidence, and empathy back into how we understand each other to lead. In this episode, we unpack the hidden forces driving moral outrage, division, and disconnection, and how understanding them can help you lead more effectively. You'll learn why we tend to typecast others as either victim or villain, and how that mental shortcut keeps us from engaging across differences. How a lack of psychological safety, not ignorance or evil intent, often prevents people from changing their minds, and how to meet them. We explore how evolutionary fear still shapes our political behavior today, even in times of relative safety, and how a prey mindset influences everything from media consumption to public policy. You'll gain insight into why facts and statistics rarely shift beliefs and what actually does. We dive into the concept of moral creep, how it makes us more fragile in safer environments, and why outrage can sometimes hold societies together but often tears them apart when misdirected. Kurt offers practical ways to rebuild trust in a polarized world by understanding how sparse social networks weaken our ability to empathize, and what you can do to foster denser, more resilient communities. This episode offers real-world tools: how to ask better questions that open up transformative conversations, how to share your own story and humanize your views, and how to recognize that most people, regardless of politics, are motivated by protection, not destruction. It's safe out there, folks. From reframing discussion to bridging divides to the safety paradox to leading with curiosity instead of certainty, this conversation is jam-packed with actionable insights for anyone working to heal our politics from the inside out, namely you. So, I hope you enjoyed this thoughtful, surprising, and deeply human conversation with Dr. Kurt Gray. Kurt, I don't know if there are many people who have spent more time studying kind of all the things that we talk about here: polarization, coming back together, effective leadership, and just the psychology that underlies that. You know, you're a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. You're about to make this move to, is it Ohio or Ohio State? I don't want to screw that up.
Ohio State. The Ohio State is what they say.
Yeah, because that's a thing over there. So you're director of these two labs. You have an adjunct professorship. You have this book that's performing really well, Outraged. I saw you're number one in your category on Amazon. That's impressive. But how would you even describe your work? What do you do?
At the end of the day, what really gets me interested and what got me interested in this whole field of understanding morality and politics is this really old philosophical problem, which is the problem of other minds. Right? I think it's so especially when we're on a podcast, right? Like, I'm talking to you. How do I know you are not AI? How do I know that what you say is what you believe? How do I know you're not thinking the entire time, I hate this guy? You know? And so there's this deep gap between our mind and your mind, right? Between different minds. And that disconnect is what leads to all these terrible problems, I think, in our world, which is that you think something different than I do, and I can't appreciate that you think that for good reasons. I assume you're evil, you're stupid. And so this is this kind of what gives rise to my interest in these really deep psychological topics, right? The difficulty of understanding how other people think and feel.
How did you feel, or when, if, did you feel misunderstood?
I mean, so many times, right? I was just talking to my kids, you know, it's like yelling at my daughter, and she was like, "You never understand me, like why I'm doing this," right? I'm just like, oh my God, every teenager's like, I feel so misunderstood.
Yeah.
But, you know, a lot around politics, you know, you have a conversation with someone and you're like, well, this is why I think this way. And, you know, I talk about this in the book, and they assume that the reason that you think that way is because you somehow hate America or other people, right? It's just what I call the destruction narrative. And so many of us walk around feeling misunderstood. Like, the reason I'm doing this is I have a good reason in my heart, but people assume that you do not. And I think that assumption, that thinking that other people are out to destroy, you know, their families and their way of life, I think is really bad for us and is tearing us apart.
I think we all are experiencing that. I mean, whatever party you are part of, the belief that democracy is in peril or in decline, regardless of what you think the reasons for that are, is increasing. And you talk about that a lot. So I think that that's sort of incontrovertible. I'm curious about what drove you into this work in the beginning. Like, who were you in your family growing up? Like, as a little one, what was your role?
It's a good question, actually. I've never thought about this. Yeah, I mean, I was an only child, and my folks were divorced, so I spent a lot of time being, shuttled between ends of the country. My dad was in the Navy, and we moved almost every year when I was a kid. And so there was a lot of adapting to new places. There was a lot of reading the room to figure out how people thought, right? How people felt. And so it always took me at least a year to kind of start to be a participant somewhere, because I had to look and understand the norms and in some sense the morals of where I was at, right? Whether I was living in England, when my dad was posting there, or moving to Western Canada, I had to really understand the kind of thoughts and feelings of people. And so I guess who I was really just someone who first studied where people were at and then tried to act in such a way that I would fit in, not compromise who I was, but really just kind of like, find a way to kind of connect with those around me. And I think that's kind of like the through line to where I'm at now, right? So like I want to study where people are at, not immediately judge them, but kind of figure out where they're at and try to blend in or at least connect.
So in some way, your upbringing is the perfect apprenticeship for the work you're doing, in that you had to be a little socio-psychologist fitting into all these different cultures with different backgrounds and contexts and norms and forms of morality or dress to fit in, even though you weren't thinking about it in those terms. And that understanding those things, I would imagine, this is now me as a coach sort of interpreting, but became part of the strategy for your own safety and security.
Exactly right. And we, as human beings, we need communities to flourish and to feel safe. And if you move around a lot, right, to different communities, then you have to figure out the best way is to get into those communities and to understand how they work. And so that's absolutely right that I gained an appreciation for having to fit in, and also a sense of, I've never moved to a place where I thought, everyone here is evil. Everyone here, wants to hurt me and destroy the world they live in. All communities are like trying to nurture each other in their own way. And so I also gain an appreciation for that. No matter who you are, you're always trying to kind of protect yourself and those you love.
When I was in my early 20s, because I could and because I'm curious of traveling as much as I could. Grateful to live in a town that had off seasons, and so no one cared if you were here or not. And if you had a backpack and a couple dollars, you could kind of go to some weird places. And I was, for whatever reason, always attracted to going to places that were as far outside of my cultural, societal norm or governmental norm as possible, because I wanted to see the plurality of ways that humans lived. And so I found myself over the years in places that, if I believed the news media or I believed the last person I talked to before I left America, that I definitely shouldn't go to, that those people hate us, that you won't be welcomed or treated well, that it will be dangerous. I traipsed through Iran and through Haiti and through North Korea and Cuba and Paris, right? They hate Americans. My experience has literally never been that, with one exception. I have always found deeply kind folks who are as curious as I am about me and where I come from. So I guess that's how I kind of arrive at that experience.
The one place that did hate you, why? And is there a way to see their behavior through a lens of actually trying to protect themselves, or what do you think?
Yeah. Okay, so this is great. So I don't think that they hated me, first of all. But the country in question was Russia. And it was really the only, and I'm saying this very openly because I'm very open on the podcast, but of all the places I've been to, it's the only place that I went to that I felt made me more xenophobic. And what I experienced there was two things, and I got to call out the good with the bad. I couch surfed all of Russia across 9 time zones. Okay, so I stayed with strangers in their homes. They opened their doors to me, they fed me, they stayed with me. I have friends that I still speak to from Russia. So I certainly met a lot of warm, open people. But my overall experience of the culture was it being extremely cold, and very much oriented to tearing folks down to whatever level one found themselves at rather than helping lift others up. And I went from Russia through Mongolia to China on this trip. And at the time, this is 2012, Russia and China were both BRIC countries. I guess they are BRIC countries, right? But like the fastest rising economies. And the difference in the people that I stayed with couch surfing in those was so stark. In China at that time, everyone we stayed with was saving money to go get educated abroad, to come back to China, where they had immense pride in and saw endless opportunity. And we're going to bring that wisdom back to do something in their home country that was going to be far easier and outsurpass what was possible in America or the Western world. Everyone, literally everyone that I met in Russia or stayed with was saving money to leave Russia and never come back. And that I found really, really stark. So yeah, I didn't feel hated. I have no animus towards any of them. So your follow-up question was, can I create a story of goodwill from that or self-protection?
Yeah, I guess so. My work, when I think about and I study politics, right, we approach things with the destruction narrative often, thinking that people on the other side are trying to destroy things. But it turns out what motivates them is protection, protecting themselves, their family, their country. And so clearly with the folks in China, right, they're trying to build their country and protect themselves as well. And so in Russia, I'm wondering what kind of, concerns about harm, concerns about protection and preservation do you think drives their behavior and connects with their kind of morals?
Well, I mean, I don't ever want to get in anyone's head and assume I know what they're thinking. My practice is just to ask them and to trust them. And as long as their behavior comports with that, then we're in a good place. And if it doesn't, then I have information about how I want to spend my time and who I want to spend it with. But I don't think you have to go very far back in Russian history to understand how someone could arrive at a more protectionist mindset. I mean, this is a country that through starvation and gulags and forced exile of more of its citizens than maybe any other place on earth ever. And this is within a generation's touch. This is a country that has undergone several violent revolutions. This is a country that came to World War II to help defeat the Nazis, and then on the other side of that finds themselves as the enemy to those same powers they were fighting with. Again, engaged in bloody wars and proxy wars around the world. So there's a lot of reasons in recent memory to learn not to trust.
Totally fair, right? And interesting to think that the divisions could not be just between people within countries, right, but between people and their state or people, right, other countries, right? So I think all these divisions that we're talking about today and we're wondering about and we study, right, are ultimately about this kind of like concern for harm. And I think, my work's about how that kind of like unifies our kind of moral concerns. But super interesting. I appreciate that.
Yeah. In my experience as a coach working with people in leadership, and you work with professional groups as well, both behind the aggression or the argumentation or the attack, whether that's a physical attack or otherwise, and behind the losing of one's voice, the failing to show up, is generally a fear. It's a fear of what might happen to me if I don't, or it's a fear of what might happen to me if I do. I won't be accepted. I won't be welcomed. I'll be kicked out. I won't be understood. Or if we don't strike their missile facilities, like they're coming for us next. And so we take quote unquote preemptive action. But very often these escalatory behaviors that cause harm on all sides are completely avoidable when we look and understand our own psychology and reduce that fear through resourcing ourselves, our organization, our country, such that that fear no longer needs to drive our behavior, right? That's what I see on a daily basis. So help me understand, as you understand it, the psychology behind this. So the destruction narrative, for instance, or anywhere you want to take it, but help me understand what's happening in our brain.
I think we can start millions of years ago for the beginning of this story and human nature, because I think you're absolutely right that a lot of aggression and a lot of anger is ultimately grounded in concerns about fear and concerns about harm. But the question is, today we're actually pretty safe, right? We're pretty safe. We're like sitting in our nice houses. We're going to the grocery store, picking out all sorts of food. And even if some people are richer or poorer than others, most of us, at least in the Western world, are doing okay, right? And we have the resources and food to kind of like survive. But I think our minds are built to never accept that, and to always be afraid, and to always search out threats. And there's a myth, in addition to this assumption that the other side is motivated by destruction, there's a myth about human nature that we all believe, which is that humans evolved as predators.
Apex predators, right?
Exactly, right. And today we are, right?
Not just any old predator.
Yeah, exactly. The best predator. And we've got guns, we've got high-powered rifles, we can hunt wolves from helicopters with them. But this is not really who we are, I think, deep down in our bodies and our brains especially. In college, I thought I wanted to be a geophysicist because I grew up in an oil town. And we were doing some work up in northern Alberta, like really far north in Canada. Mm-hmm. And one night, when the helicopter was supposed to pick us up from the middle of the wilderness, it radioed to say that a storm was coming and it couldn't. The pilot was apologetic, but he said, "I'd get you the next day, guys." And so we had an entire night in the middle of the wilderness, 30 miles from the nearest town. And I'll tell you what, no one there felt like an apex predator. We are relatively weak as a species. We have tiny little claws, right? Very small teeth. And we all slept around a fire in the dark and the cold that night. And when we woke up in the morning, there were lynx paw prints around the campsite. We had been stalked in the night, and no one was going to get eaten by a lynx. They're not that big. But it still made me realize, look, we are more hunted than hunter. And in fact, that is consistent with lots of new work in kind of evolutionary anthropology, which is that for most of human history and ancient hominid history, we were eaten. Saber-toothed cats, eagles.
Can I push on this a little bit? Because I was reading this in the book and I was thinking, okay, well, a lot of this comports with my experience. I've spent a significant amount of time out in the wilderness, solo or in small groups. I know what it's like to wake up being like, is that a bear? Is that a wolf? And feeling that fear, feeling very exposed. And certainly exposed to the elements in like avalanche incidents and things like this. So that tracked with me, but it seemed like you were making the point that if you feel that fear, then you must be a prey animal rather than a predator. And I found myself asking, well, is that true and is that relevant? Is it true that predators are never fearful? Most predators are also predated upon, they're eaten, even lions, right? And so is it true that other predators are not afraid of being eaten? And is that the frame that we should use to prove that we are in fact prey animals?
It's a great point. So all animals are some mix of predator and prey, I think, in the animal kingdom. And you could be a scraggly old lion past your prime and get eaten, certainly, right? But I think if you want to know in general how people act, I think it's useful, or how any animal acts or thinks, it's useful to know in general, right? It's mix of predator and prey. And I think, you see a lion or a tiger, it's real relaxed in the middle of the day, right? Like lions are passed out in the sun of the savannah underneath a tree, kind of dead to the world, right? If you are an impala, right, you got your ears kind of twitching and you're ready to kind of like hop at a moment's notice. And, those animals, prey animals, they live in herds because that's the best way to avoid predation, unlike tigers, let's say. And humans are, and certainly monkeys and hominids that we evolved from, are a herd species. We've always got someone on lookout, and you're always concerned, especially in the dark, that someone's going to come and eat a member of your family. And there's lots of evidence that suggests that chimps and other primates, they're preyed upon. And so I think even if today we're actually quite safe, and even if for today we're apex predators, we can't shake that feeling, which is why if you're home alone at night and it's dark and you hear some noises from your basement, everyone's like, oh my God, like what, do I take my gun? Right? Do I take a frying pan? Like, what is that? Right? Everyone gets a little worried because in our heart of hearts, I think we're still more hunted than hunter.
Okay, so let's assume that that's true. And so we have this sort of base wiring to be looking for threat. In its best form, that ability paired with our cognitive ability to project not just to the next task or season, but like years ahead of time is what's allowed us to build all of this physical safety, to create worldwide economies, to create the technology that we're talking on. The flip side of that, I guess in its more extreme example, is hypervigilance in, say, the form of PTSD, right? Where you're like always so acutely looking for threat that it's debilitating to the organism.
Absolutely. That is the fine line that humans live with every day. Like the humans that are like, I'm not going to think about the future. I'm not going to worry. Right? Those are the humans who maybe don't get a job. You don't save enough for retirement. Or maybe they're the humans who fall off a cliff while taking a selfie. And there's dozens of people every year who die in dumb ways because they're not sufficiently concerned about the threats that still exist.
Yeah, totally. This is raising a question for me, which I'm not looking for your personal opinion. You can give it, but lest another NPR reporter yell at you. But what in your studies or science, what have you learned about this, let's call it a trend of presence, right? Everywhere you look, the buzzword is presence, be present, find presence, mindfulness. Like, what does your research, how would your research comment on that?
In some ways, it's a reaction against the concerns and anxieties about the future.
Sure.
You want to live in the now. That's great. You want to not worry about the future. That's fine. But to be honest, I think it's really going against human nature. And I think that's okay, right? Because human nature also involves like tribalism and things that, we shouldn't be proud of. But oftentimes, like living the now could be living in fear, could be worrying about, like, live in the now when you walk home, right, through a dark alley. You know what that now is going to be like? It's going to be filled with fear that someone's going to jump out at you. And so, I'm an optimist about human nature, or about society, but I'm also a kind of realist in the sense that, like, there's so many things that are baked into how we live and how we act in the world. And part of the reason that we're here today is because we're a species that worries, and the people that passed on their genes in the past are the people who were thought, I wonder if there's a bear in those woods. I'm going to stay out of them and hang with my family, right, instead of getting eaten. And so it's hard to deal with this legacy. And at the same time, there's things that are just terrible for us, like social media. And we have some studies that show that people who use social media for politics and check virality metrics, which are indicators of whether other people are panicked about things, they basically have PTSD. It's above clinical thresholds for PTSD. So you're absolutely right? Like, these are terrible things to live with. And so I agree we could do less of that and live in the now, especially when the now for us is pretty safe. I don't want to shame people for not being able to kind of, throw off the shackles of human nature that's been with us for millennia.
Okay, this makes me want to go in two directions. So one is kind of what you just talked about, the impact of not just social media, but let's call it external societal influences on our perspective, the objectivity or relativity of perceived reality. The other is when talking about morality, which you study, but it's like it's morals, but it's also norms. They're different, but they're interwoven. I think most of us, certainly I often find myself being like, well, what is the right thing to do, right? What is the equation that we can run over and over again to create the best possible outcomes for self or others? But the reality is probably that there isn't one, that it is constantly in flux or changing over time and with circumstance. I'm curious if either of those directions calls to you more.
I think we could maybe split the difference and find a common thread between those different alternatives, which is just the power of subjectivity. I feel like we've been dancing around this, which is just like how much of our social world is just constructed based on our cultures and even our feelings in the moment, right? So what's moral? What's good? Or what should we be afraid of, for instance, in social media, right? Like in some ways, there's a there, especially in our evolutionary past, right? If there's a tiger running for you, that's bad. You should be afraid. You should be panicked. You should run. But there's so many cases where it's up for grabs, and that depends on our culture, right? So let's go to morality. If you live in a culture where like food's very scarce, and there's lots of rules about food sharing, and you're a real jerk for hoarding food. But if you live in a culture where there's lots of food, then the rules, the norms are much looser, and they can be more norms than morals, right? So how we can maybe start with how our morality evolved, which is really just about safeguarding us and our tribes in particular contexts.
Yeah, this reminds me, I'm not going to get the exact example right, but there's a book about weird cultures. I think it's called The Weirdest People on Earth, but like,
that's right.
Yeah, Western, industrialized, educated. And the commonality of our studies focus on people only from this subset of countries in which the broader world, a much larger population lives outside of that, and the norms are not the same. And so there was one specifically around that, around food sharing. And I can't remember, some African nation was the example. But there was a threshold amount beyond where sharing food became sort of a social faux pas instead of a benefit. And from a Western perspective, you're like, that doesn't make any sense. But then you think about, well, there's no food storage. And so you're wasting that food and then nobody can eat it, right? So these kind of interesting cultural context of that. How does that enter into your thinking around the relativism of morality?
As a moral psychologist, what I study is how people make sense of right or wrong. And I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a pastor. I'm not trying to tell you what the ultimate truth is about goodness. What I'm trying to do is think, well, how do people make this judgment in the moment? And how can those different judgments, like in one country, for instance, lead to such disagreement, right? And so it's obvious if you come from one of these cultures where, let's say, there's no food storage, but other people do have food storage, right? You can put casseroles in Tupperware containers, right, in the Midwest or something. You might get offended if someone acts a certain way, but by understanding their perceptions and their context, you can see them as more human and thereby not see them as somehow evil or like intentionally, ignoring your morals, but as trying to do the rational, reasonable thing in their context. And food sharing makes sense, right? We can all make sense of that. But things like guns or abortion or immigration, the things that we argue about, those are things harder to see the other side. But ultimately, I think they're subjective impressions that make sense for the set of assumptions that people make. If you think guns protect you and there's a zombie apocalypse coming, then they're like, great, load up. But if you think they mostly hurt kids, right, then it makes sense you'll be really against them. And of course, there could be a there, right? Some positions are maybe more supported by statistical truths. But at the end of the day, a lot of these come down to perceptions.
It seems like the statistical truths don't seem to carry the day in changing people's perceptions. Is that true?
It's 100% true, right? Because you could argue they're not relevant. If you talk about guns, people will be like, look, gun access, well, that's really harmful. And then people say, well, it's not the guns that kill people, it's the people with mental illness or people who don't use the right kind of safes. And so you can argue about what statistics are most relevant. And I think that gives you a way to kind of let statistics that you don't agree with kind of slip past you in a sense.
There's sort of a koan in this, like this inherent discontinuity, right? On one hand, I'm hearing you say that if we really spent the time to understand anyone, what their life experience is, their set of pre-existing beliefs, that even if we don't agree, we should be able to understand how they arrived at where they are. I totally agree with that in my experience. But then, in the same breath, we're saying, and these people, or some people or all people, probably all people at some times, are not acting rationally or in their self-interest. We engage in self-destructive behaviors. We don't follow the evidence, even when it might be our kid that ends up getting harmed. How do these things live together?
I think they live together with some tension. And I think there's room to still be rational because the space of morality is so complicated. So you could imagine, look, there's this general rule that we should believe in, like free speech or access to firearms. And certainly there are cases when it leads to bad things, when there's hate speech or when there's mass shootings. But you can also argue that in general, these rules help protect society, right? They keep the government from tyranny in both cases. And so, again, I think you can argue like, look, this is some harms that occur, but they're preventing greater harms that we could imagine. And so even if you're like, well, you're voting against your self-interest, you're voting for this bill and like you need more tax handouts, but you're not getting them, you could still see like, well, the reason I'm voting for lower taxes is because I want this engine of innovation in my country and ultimately I'll benefit from that, right? So I think the answer is never as simple as it seems.
Okay, so I'm gonna weave my own thought into this, and then you're gonna tell me if I'm stupid, crazy, wrong, or otherwise from the research. I think the way these things can touch is that all of us are capable of high-level, evidence-based decision-making for the highest good of self and others. But when we're resistant to it, when the data doesn't matter, that is an indication that the decision maker does not feel safe. That in absence of safety, we are unable or often unable, at least inhibited from making those higher level evidence-based decisions for the higher good. In the past, that unsafety was physical, as you've talked about. Literally, 1 in 10 people would die in raiding or be eaten by an animal. Starvation was always around the corner or to the next season. I mean, you can look at the graph of human history and see how many people were dying, but the replacement rate, that thing was flat for millennia before it spiked, right?
Right, totally.
And then we enter, I think what you call like the age of safety. Is that, am I right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And now I think through the creation of the physical structures and the institutional structures that have guaranteed our physical safety, we have separated from one another. We don't sleep in the same bedroom. We don't sleep in the same shed. We don't see our neighbors. Institutionally and experientially, we don't hunt for our own food. We're so disconnected from each other and the things that are necessary for life that feeling of lack of safety is now primarily psychological. But as long as I feel psychologically unsafe, then I'm unable to come to the table and do that higher level reasoning. And if I could address that core condition of internal psychological safety, then I would have the ability to work across difference for shared outcomes. What say you?
You're right that a sense of fear and a sense of threat can definitely lead to bad choices, especially when that sense of fear or threat is imminent, right? So you're getting chased by a tiger. Obviously, it's hard to think about, how much to put in your 401k. For more psychological threats, I think it does inhibit our ability to kind of like come together. But I still think you can reason well, even if it's for a bad aim, right? So imagine like you've got some horses pulling a carriage and, the horses might pull harder or less depending on how afraid they are, but you could still harness those horses in a bad direction, right? Like you could still be an architect of evil, even if you're threatened or even if you're not feeling threatened.
How are you thinking about evil in that instance? What does evil mean to you? What are we harnessing them for? What makes something evil or not evil?
Like if you're some evil dictator, right? I guess it brings up the point of like, well, some people are evil, right? And I think it bears mentioning.
Are they? What does the science say on that? Like, are they?
There's maybe like 1% of people in the world who are psychopaths. And I think every time we talk about the book, I think it's actually useful to just to say, look, there are some people who are evil. Let's put those folks aside. You know?
But being a psychopath does not necessarily make one evil, no?
That's true. It doesn't necessarily, but it comes with it, I think, even definitionally, a sense of like callousness at other people's suffering. And I think because morality is about harm, ultimately, if you fail to appreciate that other people can suffer and be harmed and be vulnerable, then that makes us kind of immoral in a sense.
But respectfully, like if I was a genius psychopath and I lived in a medieval city, and I was really sick of getting sick all the time. And because I didn't care about all the people and all these things, and I'm paying more attention to my objective environment, and I noticed that there's a correlation between drinking of the well water and getting sick, and I end up being the person that determines that we need to, say, chlorinate the water. And I'm doing it just because I don't want to be bothered by being sick, but it keeps a bunch of people from dying over millennia. Like, I don't think that makes me evil, does it?
No, but I wonder about the correlation between, sanitation insights and psychopathy. I think if you found yourself getting sick and you're like, the way I get sick is by other people breathing on me, and if everyone else just died, then I would not get sick. So, but I think that's a really great point. It connects up with what we talked about earlier, and I guess it is, you can think deeply and critically, even if you're feeling threatened, especially if it's not imminent. But I think if you are feeling threatened, then it's hard to come together across lines of differences. That is 100% true, and you're 100% right,
Yeah.
right? Like if you're feeling threatened, what you're not going to do is expand out your vision of who you are and who you should talk to and who you should love and bridge if you're feeling threatened and want to close off. So I think that's absolutely right.
I mean, you used the extreme example and talked about like getting scolded by an NPR reporter for like humanizing Hitler. But I've been thinking a lot about Hitler recently because for whatever reason, those are the movies we're watching in my house. And I think about these things a lot. I mean, I'm a Jewish American. I grew up with a lot of Holocaust survivors. And it's oh gosh, I'm going to out. I'll just say a person. That's easier. Commented after watching one of these movies and watching Hitler take his own life with Ava Brown.
The Downfall, that one?
That was one of them. We saw multiple. Yeah. We're just on a kick.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, we're on a kick. Yeah. And this person said, man, I wish he hadn't done that and we could have tortured him. I was like, whoa, tell me more about that. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, well, I'm not sure it's particularly helpful to engage in the behavior that you're judging as evil to solve it. Like that seems like it's only going to make it worse. But I was trying to have my coach's brain on and not say that and just ask, well, where's that coming from? And they said, well, I just think, he's made so many people suffer. He should suffer. And my reaction was like, oh, I don't think you could be Hitler without suffering an immense amount.
Primo Levi is a Jewish man who was in the camps and wrote an amazing number of insightful works. And one, he talks about the gray zone, right? This kind of like complexity of good versus, I think he'd say Hitler's evil, but he talks about this complexity of how people do good and how people do evil and what are the impulses that lead to that. So I appreciate what you're bringing up is that things are much more complicated than we think. Questions of pain, questions of suffering. And I think you're right that people who do bad things are often in pain. I mean, people bring up with Hitler, like, oh, he didn't get to go to art school. It's like probably not worth causing genocide because you're a frustrated artist. Or he was abused as a child, certainly the case.
Yeah, he was beaten regularly, as I understand it. He certainly fell into a victim narrative, which is something we might talk about, and perpetrated some of the worst atrocities in human history. There's no way around that. But
absolutely,
other than Hitler, have you ever heard of someone who killed themselves, committed suicide, and thought, oh, they must not have been suffering?
Yeah, that's a great point. I guess I don't know a lot of people who have done a lot of evil deeds who've committed suicide.
You know of a lot of them, actually. You don't know them personally, but you know a lot of them. It's 80% of mass shooters.
Oh, I guess so. Like suicide by cop.
Well, both.
Huh.
You're right. That number is roughly, it's a compilation of suicide by cop and suicide, but that's the intention going in.
You're bringing up a great point, which is that, how our human mind works, right? It's not designed to really dwell on the complexities of morality, right? We have this tendency to kind of cast people as either villains or victims and never really in between in extreme cases. And so I see where this person is coming from, right? He wants this person to suffer. I think you could make the argument that, like, look, torturing someone who's evil is a deterrent for future evil. And so prisons focus on deterrence, and capital punishment is supposed to be a deterrent. We could talk about whether that's actually true. And so you can imagine there's a rational argument for what he wants. But also, I think that's just how our mind works. If you cause that much suffering to people, then you're cast as a villain and a person who can't ever suffer, except maybe what we can really kind of like squeeze out of you and torture. I don't think that we should be torturing people as a state. I think it's a slippery slope, but I can see where this person's coming from.
Totally. I can see where they're coming from. But so there's a book called The Violence Project. It is I think it's the most comprehensive study of mass shooters ever done. The TLDR is these people, for the most part, like you said, there's a 1% of anything that's going to be aberrant. But for almost all these people, they started out as normal people, and then life happened in really savage ways. And through a concurrent set of compounding influences, their isolation and pain became greater and greater. And there were a number of intervention points that were missed. That what that person didn't want to do was grow up to be a shooter. What they wanted to do was live a normal, happy life, to be seen and recognized and go about their day. And that they eventually built the story that wasn't available to them. And so this was going to be their retribution. This was going to be their torturing Hitler on the way out for all these people who did it. And people tend to go to the place where they believe the pain came from. So if your locus of pain is primarily at your workplace, you become a workplace shooter. If it's at school, you become a school shooter. If it's a white nationalist or some hate-based thing, you go target that group, right? But it's the same psychological basis. It's just happening in different ways based on the life experience of that individual. And so when I was reading your book, and I was reading it, 2-3 months after that, so that was still very present for me, thinking about this victim hero narrative. And, I think, the point that you lay out, and maybe you can describe this with more data, but it's like once we've labeled someone a victim, then they are afforded all of this grace in our minds. And if they're labeled a villain, then anything else that they do good is immediately dismissed. And my reaction was, but they're both just people, and we all do good stuff and fucked up stuff over the course of our lives. The degree of that, the amplitude of that, the frequency of that's going to vary based on life circumstance, by biology, all these things. But really, if what we're seeking is not retributive feeling of justice, but actual better outcomes, then isn't our primary job to humanize both the villain and the victim and come back to a more shared understanding of humanity?
I think if we're trying to move humanity forward in a let's all get along and let's help us flourish, I think that's absolutely right to think not of retribution, but rehabilitation and things like deterrence. But I think, I don't know, maybe it's naive to think about our human mind as being something other than something that like needs to bin things into categories. And I and you and many people think that we should consider more shades of gray and, think of us not 100% black and white. But we're going to make it mostly black and white because, and I think this is a kind of truth underlying cognition, is like thinking is for doing, but also doing influences thinking. And so if you think, look, sometimes we just have to put people in prison. And sometimes we maybe have to execute people or exile people. And so once we do that, then we need to kind of reason backwards in a sense and justify that decision. if we put someone in jail, well, then they must be evil. And it's hard for us to think that we put someone in pain in jail, right? Because they're still suffering in jail. And so we shape our cognitions and our thoughts to justify our behaviors and now think they're 100% a villain, right? And not a victim. But you're absolutely right that in practice, what is it? Hurt people is the phrase, right? And the people who are perpetrating evil are those who are abused most, right? And of course, not everyone who's abused, and thankfully, not many, are also turned into abusers. But yeah, it's hard not to engage in this moral typecasting that in my work's identified, seeing someone as either a villain or a victim, as either causing suffering or as feeling it.
So you've unearthed that we do this. Great. I do it. I like one of the hardest things for me to get over is just being judgmental. I grew up in a very judgmental culture, and like I have to be so aware of that in my brain and actively work to mitigate for that. And now a quick break from our sponsors, and we'll be right back to the show.
Leadership is about making tough calls under pressure. The key is knowing who to trust. When Aspen faced short-term rental and zoning challenges, I turned to Skyrun Vacation Rentals in Aspen. They gave it to me straight and trusted me to do what was best for our community. With their help, we crafted balanced regulations that strengthened our economy, supported locals, and preserved our character. If you need expert guidance in a time of STR or zoning challenge, give them a call. And to experience their commitment to community and care in Colorado, don't take it from me. Use code HOP15, that's Healing Our Politics 15, for 15% off a stay, whether for yourself or someone in your community. There's a link in the show notes. Feel free to pass it along. The Healing Our Politics podcast is brought to you by the Elected Leaders Collective, the first leading and most highly recognized name in mental health, well-being, and performance coaching for elected leaders and public servants, designed specifically for you. Now, don't be fooled by the name. The Elected Leaders Collective is not just for elected leaders. It is for all public servants, staffers, volunteers, government, nonprofit, whole organizations. This is for you. If you are filled with passion for improving your community and world, but are tired, as I am, of the anger, stress, and vitriol, if you find yourself banging your head against that same wall, struggling with the incoming criticism and threats, arguing with colleagues who are supposed to be on your team, and questioning if it's even worth it anymore, then the Elected Leaders Collective programming is specifically for you. With the Elected Leaders Collective, you will learn to become a hashtag political healer, building the authentic, unshakable confidence and courage to stay true to yourself through the anger and pressure, while cultivating the open, empathetic mind to meet others with the curiosity, compassion, and kindness necessary to respond to threats, improve challenging relationships, de-escalate conflict, and bring people in your community together to solve real problems and get shit done. You'll reduce stress, anxiety, and overwhelm, and become a more effective leader while having time for your family, yourself, your health, and your wealth, sleeping well at night, and showing others they can too. Now that's leadership. Healing Our Politics listeners receive 10% off all Elected Leaders Collective services using the code hashtag political healer. Use it today and become one of the brave political leaders healing our politics. Use code hashtag political healer by going to www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today. That's www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today. Why is it bad then? Like, why is it bad that we're outraged? Why is it bad that we're hyperpartisan? Why is it bad that we're typecasting? Why should we care? Why should we do anything about it?
Well, before we say why it's bad, and I think we started this conversation a little bit implicitly recognizing that it's bad, I think we can acknowledge that it can be good, right? If you live in a culture where there's outrage, it kind of nudges people, sometimes pushes people to really follow the rules. And there's sometimes some culture, some context where that's really important.
Yeah.
And so, I'm sure you've traveled to Japan. Japan is a tight culture. And what a tight culture means is that you have to follow the rules almost all the time. And if you don't, you get in trouble. So there's a cop on almost every block on Tokyo, and they make sure you don't jaywalk, and they yell at kids for acting out, right, in a way that cops in America would never do that. Why? Well, the argument is that Japan as a country has faced a ton of threats. Natural disasters, especially, right, tsunamis, earthquakes. And when you live in a culture where there's lots of threats, you have to cooperate really well. And that means you have to follow the rules, right? If a tsunami horn goes on, everyone has to evacuate, right? You can't decide like, I'm going to decide if I want to do it myself, right?
I am not, by nature, I'm just not a rule follower. And there are things I love about Japan. I mean, the precision, the dedication, it is such a perfectionist country, right? Like you can dedicate your entire life to the perfectly processed grain of rice. And it's incredible to behold. The rule following is tough for me. So I'm on the streets of Kyoto and I stop off at this little like matcha crepe shack, which I'm like, oh, this is going to be amazing. And I order with the lady, and this is maybe a 3-foot long cart, right? So she's got an order side and a pickup side, but the whole thing is less than your arm span. And so I order this and she starts cooking and she's like looking at me and she's doing it. She looks at me and I swear to God, she stops in the middle of cooking to get out from behind the little 3-foot cart, walk around and look down and points me to the stickers of feet on the other foot of the cart. That's the pickup window. So I could wait in the appropriate place.
Was there other people in line behind you? Oh, wow. Yeah.
No.
Amazing.
And I was like, yeah, that's just like one of those moments. I'm like, Japan, gotcha.
Yeah. But at the same time, right, things run, right? They have like this amazing tsunami support system. And so outrage and something like that seems crazy, right? But in some sense, it's like part of this like bigger enterprise of keeping everyone safe.
Yeah.
And I think you gave us a reason why it's a little bit bad, because you're like, what, does it really matter, this kind of judgmentalness?
Which I was doing while saying that, so sorry, lady. That crepe was amazing.
Exactly. But I think when it's bad is when it leads us to dehumanization, when it leads to disconnection, when it leads to violence, right, and unwillingness to engage with others. Like, that's when it's bad. And so, again, there's like two sides of the exact same coin. On one hand, it pushes people to follow the rules, and when people don't follow the rules, then we punish them because that helps them follow the rules in the future or encourages other people to follow. But if it's too arbitrary a rule or too like legitimate a source of disagreement, and we still try to punish people and dehumanize people, then I think it tears society apart, as it happens now, right, in America. 50% of people think one thing, 50% of people think the other thing. And it's not just that we're like dehumanizing the 1% of people who are evil, we're dehumanizing our friends, our family, our neighbors, half of the country.
How does that negatively impact me? So if I'm one of those folks, and I have been one of those folks that thinks everyone with a particular political label or party is bad, evil, dumb, or otherwise, which in my early 20s I was, what would you say to persuade me that that's not the optimum way for me to live for myself?
I get that question a lot, especially in this current political moment with a book that touches on bridging divides. And I think there are two answers. One is the personal and one is the societal. And the personal is, it's kind of a miserable way to be filled with hate, not to channel Jedi masters, but the dark side kind of corrupts us. And if every time you can have a meaningful human interaction with someone who disagrees with you and you just refuse to talk to them and you're filled with animosity, I think that poisons us. And it prevents us from growing as a person and recognizing the complexity in the world and in ourselves and from learning from each other.
Yeah.
And certainly if you have a family member who disagrees with you politically and you've shut them out, or a spouse, I think we're cutting these social ties that are so important, and we're narrowing the sphere of who we will see as human and who we will interact with to such a narrow scope that we lose out on the richness of social connections that we could have that would make our life fulfilling and less lonely.
I got a really weird analogy that just kind of popped through from your book, which is the Habsburg family.
Uh-huh.
In some ways, that is a mirror of what you just said in a very strange and multi-generational way.
Exactly, right? You're keeping it in the family so much that your blood can't clot and you get a giant chin. And so in your soul, that's happening maybe by being so insular.
Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about physical inbreeding like they did, but like it was something that was seen as if I'm understanding correctly. So incest being a moral and societal no-no gets flipped on its head as a technique to balance power across Europe and create stability that allows for roads and rail and modernity to come and allows the family to sit on the thrones of multiple kingdoms. So in flipping this morality on its head, a lot of good is done in the short term for the family and for society, let's just say writ large. I'm sure lots of terrible stuff was going on during that time, as it always is. But then the inbreeding, the physical incest across cousins, causes these deformities that ultimately are the downfall of the family, and then everything emerges back into World War I,
right,
in the largest form that the world had ever seen. But there's a parallel of segmenting, and I think this honestly started with younger folks, and it started on the left, and it started in universities. This belief that I can't be around folks who disagree with me. That is unsafe, and has now sort of metastasized to people on all parties who don't. The number of conversations I have with folks who say, I won't go on a Tinder or a Hinge date with someone if I know they're of the other party, is shocking.
It's huge.
And if you ultimately end up in a echo chamber with no one who disagrees with you, like, I challenge anyone to find a time in history where that's gone well for a company, for a family, for an organization. That is a recipe for downfall.
Yeah. It's complicated because with Tinder, it's fair you want to connect with people who share your values and who you know are good people. But I think the problem is that we don't think someone who might disagree with us politically, and not even at the extremes, right? Just like who, has a slightly different opinion on you, like you're Kamala and they're Bernie, like we can get purity tests there as well, can really drive division. I think you're absolutely right that companies, to some extent families, but certainly our country was founded on the idea of pluralism.
E pluribus unum, of many one.
Exactly, right. We need, if we don't want to be a dictatorship as a country, to answer your question of like, well, why should someone engage with someone who disagrees with them, is one, because our country requires, in a sense, that there are different political perspectives that are engaging meaningfully with each other. Right, the best way forward for our country is ultimately between the extremes of the left and the right, the kind of like messy navigation that we have to do when we kind of have discourse. I guess I want to say, if you are someone who says like, well, I just love to hate people, and I think that I'm the person who's right, even then, if you want to persuade people that your view is the right, you need to build coalitions, you need to get people to vote for your idea. You still need to meet people where they're at. And this is where I bring up Daryl Davis, the black blues musician who made it his life work to befriend KKK members. Right? He's someone who's has really good basis for hating people, because these people literally hate, or at least it seemed at first to hate him because of his race. Right? And yet by befriending them, going on, lunches and walks with them, he gets them to hang up their robes. So he basically pulled people to his side of his beliefs by not hating people and by being willing to legitimately engage with people.
Yeah. Dr. Diana Smith was on the podcast. She wrote Remaking the Space Between Us. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but she talks a lot in her book. I think it's David Duke's son, former Grandmaster. I could be getting those details wrong, of a group of Jewish students and ultimately a woman who invite him to a Shabbat dinner and just really try to get to know him, not trying to change him or convert him, but just like trying to bring him into the circle. And over time, they do actually become friends, and he shifts his belief structure based on that.
Amazing. And an amazing example of, and I talk about this in the book too, the power of trying to understand, right? So often we approach these conversations with people who disagree or think differently with, first, I'm going to own them. I'm going to show them that they're stupid. And obviously we know that that's not a great way to start a conversation. But two, just to persuade them, right? To show them that my way is the right way. And I think it's funny because you never think that the other person's doing the same thing, right? And of course they are. Mm-hmm. And what goes better for conversations is just trying to learn where people are coming from. And once you learn people's core values, their core beliefs, what they see as harmful, who they're trying to protect, only then can you understand, well, how to maybe convince someone that your view also has merit. And so this quest for understanding goes a long way.
Yeah. So if people out there would like to see less hyperpartisanship, would like to have more constructive public institutions, policies, nonprofits, etc., my experience in, now almost 4.5 years of running the Elected Leaders Collective, we're about to relaunch as the Civic Courage Lab, training leaders in these skill sets from an inside-out approach. It's a hard sell, right? The sell of it's their fault, get the pitchforks is kind of an easy sell. Like you can rile people up and get them to action pretty quickly. But hey, we need to do the hard work of taking personal responsibility, of looking in the mirror, of transforming ourselves and working over time to get to know other people that we come in with pre-existing judgments and misunderstandings of, tends to get the response of, I don't have time for that. And yet we will need the people to do that work. You talk a lot about the power of stories and telling better stories. So how would we apply the art and the science of telling better stories to recruit more people to this bridging work or this collaborative work or this moving forward together work?
I think we can start with another key point about human nature is that we are storytelling animals. If you sit around the campfire, you don't throw statistics or facts at each other. We tell stories. We like telling stories. And we generally like listening to stories. Otherwise, why would we tune into podcasts or watch Netflix or go to movies, even about Hitler, right? We're excited in general to learn about different people with different thoughts, especially if it's pitched in a way that makes it understandable to us. And that can be hard with people who disagree with us. And so it could be up to us to ask questions about stories and to tell stories in a way to foster understanding. But at the end of the day, we all want to be heard. We all want to feel listened to. We want to feel safe to say what, you've said. And the way we do that, the way we feel seen and heard is to tell our story. And so I don't think it's a hard sell to say, look, the way you can better bridge divides is to share your personal stories. We love talking about ourselves on social media, right? But we tell it with a bent often of like proving someone wrong. And so we just say, like, just stick with the stories, stick with where you came from, how you feel vulnerable, what you care about. Like those are questions that we often don't ask. The question you asked me at the very beginning about like, well, the story, how I moved around and how I tried to figure out where people were thinking. I think those are great questions. So I think really the thing that people need to take away from this is how to ask better questions to elicit people's stories. And once someone's told you their story, they're very open to hear yours. And so it's not that hard, actually. You just try to find a couple deep questions. You try to ask people those questions. You listen to what people say. And then you're already halfway there.
What might be some of those deep questions that people should ask?
Great question. You could think about, you mentioned Tinder, going on a date, right? Like, what's a good date? It's not someone who just talks about how rich or smart they are, right? It's someone who tries to get to know you. And we often think in these conversations that we should ask superficial questions. Hey, that weather, it's been hot, hey? What about that sports team? Pretty good run, hey? No one wants to talk about these questions, right? But we could ask questions like, hey, what was it like growing up, how you grew up? Who was your first love? What's your favorite pet? How do you think you might die one day? It sounds like crazy asking people these questions, but studies have been done that show people really latch on to these questions of conversation and enjoy talking about it. It sounds crazy at first, but you're like, oh my goodness, thankfully, a chance to move past the mindless chit chat and connect as human beings. You know, there doesn't need to be a code book as much as just figure out when people are talking, like actually how they think and feel and where those thoughts and feelings come from. And you'll do a lot better than your current conversation.
You know, this reminds me of, there's an artist, and I can't remember their name, but if we can find it, I'll put it in the show notes, who did these giant exposés of portraits, like headshots of Israelis and Palestinians. And they were stripped in the headshots of any, garb or clothing that would make them identifiable to one side or the other. And then they built these giant boards and displayed them in both places. And the whole idea was, without the pre-existing knowledge of which side they're on, these folks are pretty much indistinguishable physically, like they're the same. And so I sort of had the thought of, like, what would it look like to have a set number of deep open questions, some guidance around your story, not others, personalizing it, and kind of taking us through that blindly. And then at the end, you say Democrat, Republican, Southern, Northern, whatever, but you've had to connect with the human first.
Yeah. I mean, there are things, there is a protocol that you can do this in psychology studies. It's called the Fast Friends protocol. And in a half an hour, you go through a series of questions. There's 3 tiers of questions, kind of a little deep, middle deep, and very deep. And at the end of that half an hour, you are fast friends with those people. And people keep in touch for years after being in studies together. Marriages have happened, I'm sure. And I think you probably get a sense of whether they're liberal or conservative, but I think it would certainly give people a solid foundation for having a better conversation.
Interesting.
You know this Heineken ad?
Yes, I do.
Where they build a bar together. I mean, I'm sure they don't talk about deep things, but they do something together, right? They experience something. It's not self-disclosure, but it's working together. And many people decide to stay and talk about, questions about transgender rights or things like this, right? And so really connecting first goes a long way to making people being more open.
Are there any other protocols, question sets, even studies that you'd point people to for their own research or edification?
Sure, yeah. So Fast Friends, if you just type into Google Fast Friends questions, things will come up. Nick Epley at the University of Chicago, and I talk about him in the book, has done some amazing work randomly assigning commuters taking the train into Chicago to have really deep conversations with people next to them on the train. And what I love about his studies is he asks people in advance, how much do you think you'll like these conversations? And they'll say, in general, I won't. I'd rather just sit in silence. But then you take the train in and you ask people about, their deepest hopes and darkest fears, and they feel really good after those train rides and feel socially connected in a way they didn't know that they were missing. And so, he has a whole bunch of research just showing that we underestimate how much people want to be social and how much we underestimate how much we want to be social. And so you could look at his work too.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine in the age of Amazon and the iPhone, most of us, whether we're aware of it or not, have a lot of social anxiety and fear of, will I be understood, accepted, cared about? It's easier to avoid that and stay in the phone than it is to have, the vulnerable conversation. But our deepest drive is for connection.
Exactly. We are a herd species, and we live in fear many times, right? We don't fear getting eaten, but we fear being abandoned or dismissed by fellow members of our tribe. But in general, people are looking forward to connecting. So you can just ask that question.
It raises the question, right? Like, what happens to a herd species when it stops being heard?
Yeah. And this is the kind of atomization we're facing today, right? Where people are not connected. We have some research on this that, when your social network is no longer dense, and what density means in the kind of scientific sense is where your friends know each other. Like a family is typically dense, right? Your mom knows your dad knows your sister knows your mom, everyone knows each other. And if you leave one person, you refuse to talk to your sister ever again, then you basically can't talk to your mom or dad either, right? And so in dense networks, you have to figure shit out because otherwise you lose everybody. But today, we're not really in dense networks. Like, you have a friend in Malaysia, you have a friend online, you have this other friend who you knew from college. And if one of those friends pisses you off, you can drop one of them and still have your other friends. The networks are not dense, they're sparse. And so it makes it so we're not really motivated anymore to maintaining our networks because they're so sparse. And so we need to kind of reestablish these dense networks, right? Like the show Friends, everyone knows each other, or like kibbutzes or communes, those kind of things where you need to figure it out because all the people are your people. We live in a herd.
Yeah, and it speaks to the ability in leadership to come together to solve problems, right? If people are all growing up in these atomized places where they never have to learn to talk through anything that's challenging, really, like what happens to society when all of a sudden, generationally, that skill set is required for the functioning of society?
I mean, it's not great news. And there's a sense where we can be endlessly atomized. So maybe you're like, well, I'm with Protestants, they're Catholics, but like, actually, I'm not just Protestant, I'm kind of, Methodist or Episcopalian or Presbyterian. But within Presbyterian, right, I'm like this particular area. And so you get these smaller and smaller clusters where you refuse to talk to anybody except your own little person. And then you get pissed off with those people and you're like, I'm just going to be online now. And right, we're no longer a herd at all.
Yeah. Okay, so the last thing that I just really want to touch on is this idea of moral creep or concept creep. And you talk about it as it relates to harm. I will tell you, I spent most of the book being like, I don't need to get outraged. I've done my work. And then you hit the right story and I felt my outrage, which was Mrs. Wallace and her sons. Do you remember this story? Yeah. I was perplexed. Can you talk about what this idea of concept creep or moral creep is, how it functions, and kind of how we're all ensnared in it, even if we're judging it? I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, right. The very existence of the concept is an example of it.
Yeah.
So, and let's go back into time. We're getting eaten by saber-toothed cats. We're getting eaten by eagles, right? We all agree on what's harmful. Fast forward to today, we're no longer as physically threatened. We're not getting beaten as much. We're not getting murdered as much. We're much safer. And yet our mind is still hardwired to detect threats, right? Because the ancestors who survived are the ancestors that worried about threats. And so because we're still so motivated to find threats in our environment, we end up finding them. That's the crux of this idea of concept creep, right? And so the example I use in the book about food, right? If you are starving and there's a grocery store, then the concept of food is actually pretty narrow, right? It's only food that's prepared fresh at a grocery store in a package. But if you're starving and there's no grocery store, right, you're motivated to find food, but now you're living in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, right? There's no reasonable food, and you come across a tin of cat food. Now you think, oh my goodness, that's going to be delicious. Whereas before, in an era of grocery stores, right, that wouldn't be considered food. It is now, because food is rarer, you're motivated to find it, and so your concept of what counts as food has crept to include things like cat food.
And so this is like, initially we used to think of, and kind of generalizing here, of course, but, bullying was physical abuse, and then it was direct verbal abuse, and then it was, for some people, slights or not being invited to something, right? There's this like continual evolution of what constitutes the thing.
That's right. What's harmful, right? What counts as harm? Bullying, trauma, all these things used to be really severe because those things were frequent enough to kind of fill our need to find things. But as we became safer and safer, as schools clamped down on bullying, we still had the desire to find the bullies, right, to pinpoint the bullies. And now, as you say, right, it's milder and milder forms. It is the case that progressives are slightly more likely to kind of show concept creep, But it's not just progressives. I had a colleague, very conservative, and he said, look, liberals, are terrible with their kind of need for safe spaces, and they're kind of complaining about microaggressions. And then soon after, he tells the story of how he feels really isolated and aggressed against because people give him dirty looks in the hallway, and he can't talk about his beliefs in faculty meetings, and he's not getting invited to parties.
Right. He just doesn't call them microaggressions, but it's the same thing.
Yeah, from microaggression, exactly. And so all of us today are like, well, we're less likely to get blown up on the way to home. And so now we're worried about these relatively safe things like a van that drives by slowly. Like, are those kidnappers trying to pick up my kids?
And there's an inverse correlation between real harm and felt harm.
Yes, that's the crazy part, right? So the safer you are, there's actually some work on this, that the people in safer countries are more likely to kind of show symptoms and self-identify as having PTSD. Because our scale or our scope of what's harmful has shrunk so much that now when something seems mildly harmful, or is mildly harmful, I should say, in a kind of universal sense, it feels much more harmful.
Yeah, which is like kind of this whole field of like fragility or anti-fragility and the ability to train those things. It's, I don't know, I find the whole concept fascinating, and I love that, like you talk about, if you're upset about the concept of, say, microaggressions, then in that upset, you're being upset about something very, very small yourself. And so we're sort of all locked into this kind of perpetual slippery slope of harm.
Yeah. And I think this is why this concept's so interesting. You're exactly right. Like if you took a time machine back to, 300 years ago, or like the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, you talk to a parent and you're like, you know what? The worst thing that happens in the future where I'm from is that people are coddling their children. They're protecting them too much. They're not letting them get jobs. They're not letting them kind of like walk home alone or get into fights or get into trouble. And a parent who's like, I just sent my kid off to work in a factory where they might lose their hands in a spinning jenny, will be like, that sounds stupid.
Yeah.
Like I would love to make sure my kid comes home safe, and I would love to protect them as much as I could. I mean, I'm guessing I'm not on a time machine, but
yeah.
Right.
But the irony, right, is that the family who used to have the average of 14 children because they were on the farm and they were going to die, that was a normal, expected part of life in some way. Tragedy, of course. But now when we are so insulated, we view our situation as worse, even though it's better.
Yeah, it's wild, right? And so it's just wild how, to go back to something that we talked about much earlier, it's like what's moral, what's good, what's bad, what's harmful is really a product of our culture and our context and how much threats we're facing in our lives and how we're feeling in terms of the harms that we might suffer.
If we individually desire to shift that, so whether, a lot of people have different perspectives on this, right? Some may orient to having more free-range, anti-fragile children, and others might orient to wanting to have more physical safety despite all of this. Other than our choice of how to live our lives and be the example, what would one do to help shift the culture in a way that they deem beneficial?
I think the first thing is to recognize that people who disagree with you are motivated by the same ultimate concern. I vote a certain way or whatever because I want to protect my kids, right? With coddling, it makes a ton of sense. You're worried about your kids, right? Is it better for them to roam around and will that help them as an adult? Or is it better to protect them and will that help them as an adult? But with other issues, you need to recognize the same thing, that people vote a certain way because they think it's the best for their families and their country. And so once you recognize that, then I think you can do the next step, which is share your stories about how your upbringing, how your experiences kind of give rise to that feeling of like what's helping you protect people, right? And elicit those stories from other people so you can navigate this kind of sticky space between where you're both trying to protect society, but you're going about it in very different ways. And so not only humanizes people on the other side, but also allows them to see your side as more reasonable and might come to kind of convince them a little more about where you're coming from. But again, not throwing facts at each other, but sharing those kind of stories, those narratives that help them understand you.
Yeah. Anything we haven't touched on that you would really want to say, share, or discuss?
I mean, if people come away knowing that they shouldn't just hurl facts at each other, they should tell stories and they should listen to understand, and that ultimately what we're all disagreeing about is our shared belief in kind of protecting ourselves and worries about harm, I think then we're good.
Yeah. Where can people find you, read you, interact with the lab? Any way that you guys would want folks to interact?
I mean, the book, Outraged, Why We Fight About Morality in Politics and How to Find Common Ground, they can find me on LinkedIn, and we've got a Substack, Moral Understanding is a Substack, and, we've got a lab website, Deepest Beliefs Lab. Google me, you can find me, but I think if they want to hear more, the Substack's a great place.
Beautiful. Final question, same for everyone on the show, which is this audience are the proverbial humans in the arena. So if you could leave them with just one thing, could be a study, a quote, an anecdote, a practice, a book, could be your book, anything at all, that would best resource them to be a vector for healing our politics. And by politics, I mean our larger public and social systems. What would it be?
We touched on this already. I think it would just be asking a question. So maybe I'll tell a story. The story is not in the book, but I think it's my favorite story of how you can connect. And so I hopped in an Uber some time ago, and the driver asked what I do, and I said I'm a professor, and he said, what do you study? And I say politics and morality, and he basically said, well, I've got a story for you, or a perspective for you. He says, I'm a Christian nationalist, but not the typical kind. I've never met a Christian nationalist before, let alone an atypical one. And so what I did was I said, that's interesting. I've never met a Christian nationalist, let alone an atypical one. Can you tell me what your beliefs are and what you think? And so he tells me where he's coming from, what he thinks about the family, what he thinks about the church, what he thinks about religion, his economic views, where he came from politically, economically, his jobs that he's done, the members of his family. And so I asked him questions, follow-up questions, to really understand his beliefs for 20 minutes. And then as we're getting close to the airport, we start talking about abortion. And it's clear he's pro-life. And as we are pulling up, he says, anyone who's pro-choice, I think they're basically like the Gestapo in the concentration camps. And I say, hold up. You can't say you want to have a reasonable conversation about morality and politics, as we've just done, and compare half the country to Nazis. It's just not true. And it's not, I teach a class on this, and it's just not acceptable, right? Because where do you go from Hitler? Nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
And what he did gave me a ton of hope, and it's something I rarely hear in conversations about morality. And he says, you know what? I'm sorry. I take it back. I was just trying to make this point about a slippery slope. If you don't respect fetuses as life, you won't respect other kinds of life. And I say, it's fair. You can make a slippery slope argument, but you just can't compare people to Nazis. And he says, I apologize. And then we basically, end the conversation. I get out, and he says, thanks for having this conversation. I learned a lot. And mostly it was me who felt like I learned about his beliefs. But the fact that he came away with that conversation, now taking back his kind of extreme beliefs of pro-life people, and that he came to respect me, a kind of more progressive academic for the most part, in many ways, I think is a win. We came to see each other as human beings. And I think in the future, he'll be kind of less prejudiced against people who might disagree with him. And so I think the way I achieve that, and we achieve that together, is by asking questions to understand. And I think that's what I'll leave people with, right? Don't try to persuade at first, just try to understand. And you'll be surprised with how much you'll actually persuade other people about your own humanity.
How many stars did you give him?
5 stars.
Oh, that's a great place to end. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for the work that you're doing. It's really beautiful to see more and more science, observational data, and research around this, because this is really one of the most pressing problems of our time. And in my observation over the long arc of history, this is cyclical. Societies crumble and they build, and they crumble and they build, but they don't have to crumble in violence and suffering. And the work that you're doing hopefully allows us to have a upward trajectory, or at least a soft landing.
Appreciate that. And thanks for having me on the show and for the work you do, kind of connecting all these insights to people who are actually making change.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you want to put what you've heard here today into practice, sign up for our newsletter, The Leader's Handbook, where each month you'll receive just one email with a curated selection of the most useful tools and practices discussed on this podcast today and over the course of the last month, delivered in simple how-to worksheets, videos, and audio guides, so you and your teams can try and test these out in your own life and see what best serves you. And lastly, if you want to be a vector for healing our politics, if you want to do your part, take out your phone right now and share this podcast with 5 colleagues you care about. Send a simple text, drop a line, and leave the ball in their court. Because the truth is, the more those around you do their work, the better it will show up in your life, in your community, and in your world. Have a beautiful day. As leaders, we all face contentious situations. As an Aspen City Councilman, I navigated some of the most contentious STR and land use conversations in a generation. And while most were engaged in a food fight, profit versus community, Skyrun Vacation Rentals, a company built on community-first values for 20 years that I know personally, helped me find a solution that created positive outcomes for everyone. If you want responsible vacation rentals in your community to strengthen the local economy, Skyrun is the vacation rental company for you. To experience their commitment to care and community up close, use code HOP15, that's Healing Our Politics 15, for 15% off a stay at one of their locations, whether for yourself or someone in your community. There's a link in the show notes below. Feel free to share it. The Healing Our Politics podcast is brought to you by the Elected Leaders Collective, the first leading and most highly recognized name in mental health, well-being, and performance coaching for elected leaders and public servants, designed specifically for you. Now, don't be fooled by the name. The Elected Leaders Collective is not just for elected leaders. It is for all public servants, staffers, volunteers, government, nonprofit, whole organizations. This is for you. If you are filled with passion for improving your community and world, but are tired, as I am, of the anger, stress, and vitriol, if you find yourself banging your head against that same wall, struggling with the incoming criticism and threats, arguing with colleagues who are supposed to be on your team, and questioning if it's even worth it anymore, then the Elected Leaders Collective programming is specifically for you. With the Elected Leaders Collective, you will learn to become a hashtag political healer, building the authentic, unshakable confidence and courage to stay true to yourself through the anger and pressure, while cultivating the open, empathetic mind to meet others with the curiosity, compassion, and kindness necessary to respond to threats, improve challenging relationships, de-escalate conflict, and bring people in your community together to solve real problems and get shit done. You'll reduce stress, anxiety, and overwhelm, and become a more effective leader while having time for your family, yourself, your health, and your wealth, sleeping well at night, and showing others they can too. Now that's leadership. Healing Our Politics listeners receive 10% off all Elected Leaders Collective services using the code hashtag political healer. Use it today and become one of the brave political leaders healing our politics. Use code hashtag political healer by going to www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today. That's www.electedleaderscollective.com and starting today.